we will start in. Fascinating topic this week, and particularly, I think, apropos topic this week, social media and its influence on things like politics. So Humphrey starts off talking about power. What's this deal with three different kinds of power? What are they that she actually quoted Max Weber in talking about? You guys talked a little bit about this in the discussion. Each of you had examples of some of these. What were they?
Totalitarianism, bureaucratic, and that's a good one. Totalitarian, bureaucratic, and charismatic.
Right. And how are they different one from another? Doesn't have to be Castor. It can be anybody.
Well, from what I understand, bureaucratic power is diplomatic. So decisions are made not by one person, but after consensus and so on has been arrived at.
It doesn't necessarily mean that it's not done by one person, but it's more the mechanism. It's more the idea that bureaucratic power grows out of an organized hierarchy and a system of rules, and that if you are subject to this particular system of rules, then you are subject to bureaucratic power. It might actually be somebody at the top of the pyramid making a decision, but it would probably be done by saying, well, our policy is as follows, and you have violated our policy, therefore these actions will be necessary. The idea that it's proceeding through organized rules and an organized hierarchy is sort of the core of the bureaucratic part of the power there. So you were halfway there, Castor. How about the others? We got totalitarian power. How is totalitarian power different from bureaucratic power?
Totalitarian is more of one person's calling all the shots rather than a hierarchy.
Frequently it is, and it's often much more punishment oriented. You know, we control the rewards and punishments, therefore we're going to make you dance to our tune. And frequently there's not even an appeal to policies and procedures that might be part of a bureaucracy. There's simply a statement that we're in charge and we have control, so you're going to do what we say. So how about charismatic power? Who has charismatic power?
Well, recently, I'd say the previous president kind of had a lot of that, just influenced by people being able to effectively communicate their message and have people want to do that, not necessarily by a particular punishment structure like you might see in totalitarian, or just kind of sheer force by bureaucratic, but you know, they were able to whip the group into a frenzy somewhat.
That's one form of charismatic power. And it's certainly true that Donald Trump did have a great deal of personal attraction with at least a certain audience. Large numbers of people found him very, very compelling, for better or worse. It's hard to quarrel with that. Charismatic power also accrues to people who are, say, celebrities. You know, things popular actors, musicians, have a great deal of charismatic power, which is one of the reasons they have so many followers frequently on social media of one kind or another. Many of the people with large numbers of followers are people with lots of charismatic power. But, apparently the Kardashians, for some reason that continues to mystify me, are considered to have a great deal of charismatic power. So Humphrey's talked about, I'm going to lump three ideas in here together and ask you to help me work through how they connect to one another. She talked about the public sphere as a concept. She talked about the networked public, and she talked about the idea of a counter public. How does one fit those ideas together into something that makes sense, that you could make a coherent statement about how they relate to one another?
So my understanding is that basically like a public sphere would be somewhere that people come together to talk about the issues of the day, sort of. So
Okay.
kind of like a coffee shop sort of idea.
Okay.
And
Yeah.
then the virtual is basically the same concept, but online.
So
Was
where
my
does it,
understanding.
okay, so far so good. Where does the networked public fit in?
The counter public or the networked public?
The
networked
networked public and the counter public.
Yeah, so the networked public was what I was thinking of as the virtual coffee shop. So where
Gotcha.
you come together and you meet, and then the counter public would be sort of like, okay, there's some massive change that's happening and we're a group that really doesn't agree with it. And so let's get together and figure out ways to basically combat it.
Okay. So the idea here would be that social media and other electronic tools might provide a virtual public sphere in which networked publics and network counter publics interact about concerns of the day, issues of one kind or another here. If you're going to take the idea that the internet provides a networked society, that's different from thinking of the internet provides a networked public. One of the things Humphreys talked about was kind of a distinction between viewing reality as networked public versus viewing reality as networked society. What's the difference? I didn't give you that specific question, I know, ahead of time.
Humphreys distinguishes the languages as like the network public is more of a group, where like that concept is talking about just kind of the group as a single unit. And then the network society instead focuses on individuals existing within that, and that they can exist within multiple publics, multiple groups. It's a bit more of a complex kind of model.
So you might be part of a political party as part of a networked society. You might be part of a political party, and you might also be part of a group of hobbyists, and you might also be part of a religious group online. And those might be entirely different publics, but you as an individual node could partake of all of them and still be you, a member of a society rather than just a member of an individual networked public. So if you take that approach, if you think about the network society perspective, where an individual could be part of many different groups, what does it mean to have power in that context? Who has power in a networked society? Of what does it consist?
Let's say two factors: is number of connections, and then ability to influence those connections, whether large or small. So you have some way to not only access a great number of people, but then able to compel those people to do things you want them to do.
That makes a great deal of sense, and I wouldn't disagree with it. It's not actually what Humphreys suggests, but I like your analysis, Alex, as a way of approaching it here. And I think there's truth in what you say there. I think both of those would be clear sources of power in that context. What does Humphreys suggest about that?
Assemblages. So like groups of people that come together, but they can sort of change over time, and then you can actually block connections or make new connections. And then
Yeah,
that
it's
gives
now
people power.
you're yeah, that whole blocking connections or enabling new connections or maybe changing the whole structure of the way the network is working is what she views as the source of power in a network society view there. She also uses the term link economy. What- And we actually saw link economy surface in one of the videos that you watched this week in a kind of backhanded way. What is a link economy?
Pages that like link to other pages. So I think of it as, for example, Sudbury Valley School is like the biggest name in our type of education, and they have a links page. And so if your school's on that page, it's more likely people will find you.
Okay. And your school website might conceivably have a link back to the Sudbury School page, which would be a reciprocal link, which is a very common thing online there. So that's a good specific example of how the link economy works. Web pages that share some concern or value or priority often link back and forth to one another. At its extreme, you see it done for nefarious purposes. I'm not suggesting that your school website is being used for nefarious purposes, but if you noticed in that video you saw about manipulating the YouTube algorithm, there was a description of how it's used to artificially boost viewership by having basically many bogus pages cross-link to one another, and then have bots visit one page and follow the links. So there's not actually a human involved anywhere, and it's all fake data, but it's linked together in such a way to make it look as though many human beings are actually choosing to visit many different pages. I'm not suggesting that a link economy is a bad thing, simply that it is one property of the way the web is structured and can be used for positive or negative purposes. And I guess that's about all I was trying to suggest there. As we talk about politics and political activism in social media, since that's kind of the core for this particular week, and as I always try to mention, I'm not trying to promote any particular political perspective in this particular case. I'm interested in just the concept of the way social media interacts with politics and political issues. So Humphreys talks about several different ways that social media can enhance political activism, whatever stripe of political activism may be of interest to you, just activism and political activism in general. What are some of those ways she points out that social media helps out political activism?
Isn't one of them mobilization?
Yeah, it is. What does
So
that mean?
it's not just, you don't have to sit down at like a desktop, or you don't have to go to get a newspaper or hear it from word of mouth. Like, we now have devices that are not super expensive, like that we have internet, we have laptops at this point, phones that we can just start performing activism. That's not really what the word.
Also,
More
there's two
connected
things
with
happening
everything.
there. There's two things in what you're saying there, Katie. One is we can get the word out widely. So it becomes easier to spread whatever word it is you're trying to spread to more people who might wish to hear what you have to say. That's part of mobilization. The other thing that's implicit in what you're saying there is, and getting them to do stuff. Whether stuff is write a letter to the mayor, or stuff is show up at a particular time and place, or stuff is to try to simultaneously make phone calls to tie up the phone lines at a particular time on a particular day. It becomes easier to get more people to act in concert, to actually take specific actions in concert. That's kind of implicit in mobilization there. So that's one of the ways that she mentioned. She mentions two others. What are the two others?
Coordination and the ease that it is to connect people.
True. Makes it much easier to coordinate folks, especially when you're talking about the sort of very portable social media that Katie was mentioning. You know, if you assume that people have cell phones at this point, although everything I have read indicates that if you're going to be engaged in political protest, you better be using a burner phone rather than your usual cell phone for a variety of security reasons. But you've still got that quick access under those conditions. So there were a couple of other things she mentioned. What were they? We've got mobilization and coordination.
She sort of broke out e-mobilization from regular mobilization as
Okay.
being specifically, so more like what Katie was talking about in terms of it being specifically using like social media and electronic methods to mobilize, as opposed to other ways of general
More
mobilization,
traditional.
which is the ability to do it.
Okay. Excuse me for just a sec. You may be able to tell from my screen that the sun just came out from behind the clouds, and I'm staring into kind of a bright light here. So pause for a second. Much better. Now I can see you guys. Okay. So far, so good. There are a couple of other things that she mentioned there that one might not necessarily think about that she broke out in that particular section.
She mentioned about many, essentially getting a bunch of people to do small contributions, micro contributions to a larger cause, such as I remember the AC, oh, I'm forgetting the acronym. That's just how good it was. ACLS Ice Bucket Challenge a while back, having a bunch of people donate small amounts of money to enact real change.
Okay, so you're getting into micro contributions, which gets us into the money area. One of the things that she mentioned was lower cost for protest, lower cost of all different aspects of it, lower cost of organizing, lower cost of publicizing various kinds of activities, sometimes lowering the cost of participating in because of the degree of organization. She also mentioned something that I hadn't really thought of until I read this section, which is social media often has the effect of not just drawing public attention, but holding public attention for an extended period of time on particular issues, keeping things in front of the public eye, often far longer than they would have stayed there without the presence of social media. And in the case of activism, that can make a huge difference if you can keep people paying attention rather than letting an issue fade from awareness, as so often happens very quickly along the way. So you mentioned slacktivism and hacktivism. What's the difference?
So I take the difference quite literally, like from the names. Slacktivism is more of like people feel like others are slacking, like maybe posting something just to post it and seem like they're doing something, but not really. And hacktivism is more negative and more toxic. So like it can include doxing. And it can hinder groups that might actually be trying to be proactive.
Okay, is hacktivism always negative? You kind of gave it that spin, Katie, as I was listening, or at least it kind of sounded that way. I can see a couple of heads shaking. No, hacktivism isn't necessarily always negative. Well, what about some hacktivism examples, negative and positive?
Well, positive would be anonymous.
Is anonymous always positive?
To the best of my knowledge.
I mean, Kester, you're right that Anonymous is probably the best known hacktivist group. So there's a good start. You're right on target there with thinking, okay, we're talking about, for example, what Anonymous does. Yes, that's exactly what we're talking about. What are some of the things you're aware of that Anonymous has done?
I don't know any examples or many examples for Anonymous, but I do know of some examples around the internet of
Okay.
hacktivism is a way of vigilantism in a way. So it kind of exists in that gray where, you know, we usually come around after and determine whether it was good or bad. There's a couple examples of there be particularly negative posters. Some people posting gruesome pictures of how they treated some cats. And so a bunch of people got together and decided to take this person off of the internet by any means necessary, which included hacking accounts and, you know, silencing them. So in that sense, you know, we might think that the ends justify the means and that we took someone awful off the internet. But there are a bunch of negative ones where that same kind of energy is applied to a figure like Anita Sarkeesian. She was a reporter or a games journalist who had a feminist perspective, and a bunch of people didn't like that, and they applied the same tactics to her. And, you know, I would argue that this was a net negative. So we see it on both sides. It's mostly determined afterward whether it was good or bad.
I like your idea of describing them as digital vigilantes, Alex. I think that's probably a pretty good fit. Because in most cases, when we think about vigilantes, the gray area is often where they live. I mean, they're often problematic, but not necessarily totally bad. But one very recent example of Anonymous actually was doxing Russian soldiers, which I thought was very interesting. Is that positive or negative? Well, depending on which side of the Russia-Ukraine conflict you happen to be on politically, could probably be viewed as either one, positive or negative. Katie, you mentioned doxing, and I guess I just used the word too. What's doxing?
Kind of where you just find someone's personal information, just spread it out en masse so that people will do something or, you know, something along those lines.
So if it's somebody you want to target in a hostile way, you might get their phone number, their home address, so people know exactly where they live. You might find out where they go to church, where they go to school, where they buy their groceries, and spread this information far and wide so that anybody who wants to go bother them in some unfortunate way can in fact go harass them in one way or another. And if they happen to be a controversial figure or hold a controversial view, that can and has resulted in pretty much destroying someone's personal life, which that's problematic ethically. We're not going to go down that particular rabbit hole, as we could spend a lot of time on that. One of the
Just say
things that,
something that I thought was really interesting as I was reading all of this and sort of putting all
Sure.
of these sort of groups sort of together, these ideas, that it really jumped out at me, because I don't, be clear, I do not like BTS music at all, but their fans are like literally called an army. So they have this whole group, and they chose to mess with Donald Trump and say, order all these free tickets. So he thought all these people were coming, and then they didn't. And so they became this group that like was this social group around music, but then they transformed into a group that did activism politically and sort of hacktivist. So it was just like this really cool combination of all these concepts into one.
it does all fit together in lots of different ways. As Ted Nelson said in a different context, everything is deeply intertwined. And in this particular area, that's particularly evident there. A question that I did not warn you I was going to ask, but I'll ask it anyway. It has been suggested that social media, when we talk about social media and various kinds of activism and political influence, have been instrumental in shifting the Overton window on a number of topics. What does that mean? What does it mean to shift? Go ahead.
The Overton window is this kind of it's like, well, I guess they go every once in a while and try to measure it, but essentially, if you can imagine the range, the distribution of political beliefs, at least on the left-right scale, even though it's more complex than that, but and then you see the distribution as a normal curve. The Overton window is basically where that mean and maybe one standard deviation, either way exist, and then it can exist, on the scale. And the Overton window can shift up or down depending on how popular certain ideas are. And people were, well, I think still are, concerned that especially during the Trump presidency and his presence online, the Overton window shifted towards the right a bunch, where those ideas became much more prominent and influential. And so even what had previously been moderately left proposals were seen as extremely left, because the Overton window had now moved to the right and now is further from the mean, which was sitting somewhere on the right, as they say.
Okay. Yeah, that's accurate. And it doesn't necessarily have to be purely on a left-right kind of spectrum to talk about the Overton window. I mean, although that often fits pretty well, but to pick a particular issue, for example, cannabis legalization. Within, I don't know, maybe not your lifetime, but within my lifetime, it has gone from absolutely inconceivable for any purpose under any conditions anywhere in the United States, shifting gradually over to, well, is it possible that it might be okay for medical purposes? And then the Overton window has shifted further left until we now have legalization for recreational purposes in many states and serious discussion at the national level about legalization. That's an enormous shift in the range of views that are even considered fit for the public sphere over the course of decades, the shift of the Overton window. Another issue on which that's been really, really obvious is LGBT issues. Over the course of the last 20 years, the Overton window has shifted dramatically during that time period. Without imposing any value judgments on these, however you may feel about those issues, it's very clear that what's considered to be kind of the norm for public discourse around those issues is very different from what it would have been 20 years ago. That's the Overton window. What we view as extreme or not extreme along the way. I had to listen to a podcast, and actually the person interviewed in the podcast, "Are We on the Brink of an Information World War?" is actually a person who was also interviewed in the Manipulating the YouTube Algorithm video that I asked you to watch there. The researcher who was interviewed there talked about a number of things that were happening in the context of the 2016 election and the 2018 midterms with respect to activity in social media affecting or attempting to affect what was going on in the political sphere. What were some of the things that she discussed that she found in her research had been going on there? And what are some of the ways those things are being echoed in the current Ukraine conflict? In one case, it's an election, and in another case, it's a war, but there are some similarities there. What kind of things was she seeing? See, the trouble with things like podcasts is that you can't scan them quickly by looking over during class. It's one of the reasons I hate learning from videos. What did she describe as the role of disinformation? I'm getting the impression that maybe y'all didn't listen to the podcast this week along the way. Well, let's see if we can delve into it sideways here. One example.
I will say in defense of the class, at least for me, I did listen to the podcast, but
Okay.
I struggle with it. Like I do much better with YouTube because it's the audio and visual. I have a harder time with the audio. And so I remember it in the, like, if you ask me right after I listen to it, I can talk, but a week later, it's just gone.
Yeah, there's this thing called taking notes that sometimes helps with that, which is what I try to resort to there. But I hear what you're saying, Noel. So one of the things that she described there as an example, this was talking primarily about the election of 2016 and the midterms of 2018 when she was being interviewed. One of the things she described was finding that Russian trolls were running the largest Texas secessionist web page online during the 2016 election. Now, there's a lot in that sentence just by itself. What's a Texas secessionist web page? Who are Russian trolls? Why are they running a Texas secessionist web page? How are they running a Texas secessionist web page? So let's see if we can pick that apart a little bit.
So the Texas
Right.
secessionists are people who want Texas to be its own country. Like they don't want to be part of the US anymore. They want to be their own
Right.
standalone. So
they actually claim that, and there is some legal basis for this, that Texas alone of the state, I used to live in Texas, by the way. Texas alone among the states has the legal right to split itself into 5 states without the permission of the US federal government. But go ahead. Okay, so you're right. Texas secessionists want them to secede from the Union.
And so it seems like Russian trolls would use that in order to be more propaganda that's anti-government propaganda.
Okay, say more about why they might do that.
A lot of, at least it depends. I'm trying to tiptoe around the political parts of this. There's a lot of people who are not happy with government and think there's a lot of government overreach. And so if you rile those people up enough, in theory, they then spread your message more and possibly rile more people that could affect how they vote and if they go out and vote.
Okay, so if you're trying to sow chaos, if you're trying to make things more confusing along the way, one of the ways to do it is to find a place where there's a wedge and pound on the wedge so that people get split further apart. So in this particular case, they found a political perspective that was already represented out there. I mean, there really are Texas secessionists and have been for a very long time. And I'm sure they probably had web pages. I haven't checked. So in this case, some Russian operatives, and apparently in a very well-funded and well-planned way, began doing what they could to amplify that particular factor, to whip up the chaos along the way. Now, how might they go about doing that? I mean, that's not something that somebody does in their parents' basement on Friday night.
Well, similar to the video about manipulating the YouTube algorithm, these individuals could create pseudonymous accounts and pages, and then by various generation means create a bunch of content that is emotionally activating and not necessarily being able to detect it as spam, and then they can automate the process and have it get in front of a bunch of different eyeballs, and then after a certain point there'll be human engagement, and then from there they can then continue feeding these messages, and they can grow naturally. I know around the time there's discussion of activating memes, like activating in the sense that they are designed to make people angry, and then more likely to share it and grow the sentiment that, yeah, Texas should secede, or we don't like the current, democratic, chain of command, that kind of thing.
Mhm. So what, when the point was made that Russian operatives were doing this, sometimes in the interview referred to as Russian trolls, what's the implication there if you make the move from trolls to operatives?
That it's government organized and funded and
Mhm.
supported.
And one of the points that came through very clearly in the interview was the idea that a lot of this activity was very clearly funded and supported and well organized by some governments outside of the United States. Why? Besides the fact that they would just like to affect the election, why would they do this? What was the point made in the podcast? Is it a war?
To weaken democracy, our democracy.
That would be a reason to do it. And one of the points that she made was they think of it as a war with real strategic objectives. Weakening democracy might be one of them. Disrupting the power grid might be one of them, ultimately, along the way. The question was raised, is this an information world war, or are we on the brink of an information world war? And the podcast made the point that you sort of have to say, in whose opinion? It is an information world war in the opinion of some of the participants. We're not necessarily viewing it as an information world war. That doesn't mean it is or is not an information world war, but some of the participants are treating it that way. Let's actually go on to the video rather than the podcast here to talk about the manipulating the YouTube algorithm video, which I think absolutely fascinating. And there are 2 more in the series if you get interested. They'll go on to Twitter and Instagram, manipulating Twitter and manipulating Instagram algorithms. The video suggested that there were 2 major motivations for manipulating social media algorithms. What were they? This ties back to the World War.
Financial, the motivation to create content that will generate ad revenue, and then political influence. If they can speak loudly enough, they can get people to vote as they want.
Money and power, 2 classic motivators to manipulate the algorithm. Make money or change the way people think along the way. So how does that video on manipulating the YouTube algorithm describe the process of winning the fight against what they actually described as inauthentic online activity? What would be necessary to win the fight? Especially if this is a war, what's necessary to win the war?
The host has an optimistic kind of solution. I guess he appealed that we should become better natured as a society and not want to necessarily turn on each other. He argued that a lot of this is so easily done because we naturally want to oppose one another. He says, so we can become better natured. I don't know if that's necessarily a feasible goal, but that's what he suggested.
You mean changing human nature doesn't really seem super likely as an outcome here?
I mean, I know that there are ways to influence behavior en masse. We've talked about a bunch of things like that. But that kind of, I don't know, I think it's approaching the problem wrong. I think incentives need to be restructured for that to happen, but I'm not sure what that's going to look like.
You've got him, you're on target, Alex. That is in fact what he suggested as the only solution. I mean, he suggested that the root of the problem is that we tend to gravitate towards stuff that fascinates us and things that are kind of edgy, especially concerned with issues that we're concerned about, kind of fascinate us. So we tend to go there and we tend to go down the rabbit hole. He suggested that it's kind of a cat and mouse game, and that it will continue as a cat and mouse game until and unless we change human nature. He suggested actively practicing love thy neighbor, which is actually an excellent suggestion. There seem to be some problems with implementation, if I'm understanding historically on fully implementing that. I'm fascinated by the way that video described the process of what's going on in the background with YouTube. You know, the cross-linking, the click farms, the automated production of the content with just enough differences to fool the YouTube algorithm into thinking that it's a different content. And I'm fascinated by the fact that he, an engineer who focuses on this stuff, was actually taken in by some of it, to the point that it prompted this particular series of videos. And it makes me think, geez, if somebody who studies this full time and worked on this professionally can't disentangle all of these factors, what chance do I have as somebody who has far less knowledge and skills in that particular area? It made me much more leery of the time I spend on YouTube. I mean, like many of us, I will periodically go to YouTube and browse through videos you might be interested in down at the bottom of the screen and spend time on some of them. And it's really given me pause about my activity in doing that. How about this article on how social media took us from Tahrir Square to Donald Trump? Let's use the phrase pluralistic ignorance. What is pluralistic ignorance? Oh, come on, I told you I was going to ask you that one.
Recollection. Sorry, I'm on 5 hours. I'm trying here. My recollection was it was the idea of basically sharing more. Oh, Jacqueline's answering.
Yeah, Leanne, you're right on track. Yeah, she has a poor internet connection tonight, unfortunately. But thank you, Leanne, for weighing in on via the chat there. Yes, you've got it. It's the idea that I'm the only one who has this particular view. There isn't anybody else who thinks this way.
Yep, conspiracy. That's what I took from it. It's just kind of conspiratist mindset, maybe. Like, I'm a crowd of one, maybe. Did I get?
Well, yeah. Thinking that you're a crowd of one, and in some ways that can be a very psychologically problematic view. I mean, you know, maybe you're the only person that you know who really cares about animals, or maybe you're the only person you know who holds just a particular political view in your community because you live in a little town and you don't encounter a whole lot of people who are way different from you, and you think, wow, I'm really different from everybody else. Nobody else thinks the way I do. That's pretty scary and pretty isolated. If you happen to be in that particular situation, you can end up thinking you're a freak, which is not a very comfortable thing for most people to consider about themselves along the way. So if you've got a lot of people who are in that particular situation, the suggestion here in this article is that social media have the potential to show each of us that, in fact, we're not the only one who thinks that way. We're not the only one who cares about wild animals. We're not the only one who cares about the environment. We're not the only one who cares about First Amendment rights. I mean, there's a whole long list of we're not the only one who feels this particular way or believes this particular way. Social media, because of its broad reach, helps to break that down because it lets us get in touch with other people who may be somewhat similar to us in terms of our perspective along the way. Now, this article described kind of a historical sweep. I mean, the title, "How Did It Take Us from Tahrir Square to Donald Trump?" Describes a huge change in the sort of public view of both the internet and social media. What was the sweep that it describes from what to what? Where did it start and where did it end up, at least in the context of the article?
So it kind of started with almost like we were talking about activism, e-mobilization that went on in terms of the protests. And what was going on in Tahrir Square, where they were shutting down the information going out. And so it was a way for people to reach out and let people know what was happening, because there wasn't coverage, couldn't be coverage of what was occurring.
So it started off allowing communities to be empowered, allowing communities to gather, allowing communities to communicate and, well, to use some of the vocabulary from earlier tonight, to do things like mobilize. Tahrir Square is a good example of mobilization using social media there. And this comes from a time, boy, from a time sounds really historic, like in earlier centuries, but this comes from an earlier decade when the general view of the internet as a whole, and social media to some extent, was the idea that information wants to be free, and that the internet will be a way that everybody can communicate with everybody, and nobody will be able to put a chokehold on communication. Finally, we'll be able to get past censorship and information control. And it was a very hopeful era, saying that the internet is going to be liberating. It's going to help us form and empower community for the better of humanity. And then it started to change. And that's part of what was discussed in this particular article here. The article talks about digital platforms of various kinds, helping communities form and communicate and mobilize. But then it also makes the point that it disrupts existing communities in many cases. How does that work? Well, how did it go from we're in this together and we can finally communicate to our community is being disrupted by this technology?
The turning point the author mentions is how kind of that same force where people were like, we can finally, we can talk together, a bunch of individuals can connect and talk freely. It is also these individuals that can then be segmented, into echo chambers and, spheres of their own little bubbles. And if you can turn those bubbles on each other intentionally, then that idea of unified action quickly breaks down. And now they're spending their energy, combating one another. She mentions how Trump himself, and then of course the Russian influencers, sought to kind of turn groups on each other for their own personal gain. Trump specifically, making a clear us and them, instead of, building bridges between communities that could lead to large collective change. And then the big platforms themselves were exposed as kind of profiting off of this idea of all these individuals coming together. You know, the whole Cambridge Analytica scandal, where now people are thinking, well, I'm on this platform, but it's, someone else is profiting off of it. Someone's using that information to specifically influence individuals. So it's kind of transitioned from this idea of like, we didn't understand we can do so much with it. And then with a little bit more time, we saw how, humans behave on this specific network, and we're still kind of working past that.
And they use the terms micro-targeting, the ability to zero in and find a very highly defined audience, people who live in cold climates, are over the age of 50 and don't like shoveling sidewalks. I want to talk to them. Not necessarily for marketing purposes, sometimes for political purposes. So micro-targeting became possible, and algorithms entered the picture. And the algorithms, we talked about two motivations there, right? Financial and political. From a platform perspective, the algorithms are designed to maximize revenue for the platforms themselves. Well, if they can do that by capturing eyeballs, and the way to capture eyeballs is by attracting people to more and more edgy content in their particular little niche, then the algorithms will do that structurally. So that had that effect of doing what Alex is describing there, of driving various communities apart along the way, which is one of the reasons that the heads of a number of major technology firms have ended up testifying before Congress in recent times, concerns about those kinds of effects on sort of American society, if you will. You had a piece about the White House is briefing TikTok stars about the war in Ukraine. I stuck that in there mostly for two reasons. I mean, one, it's obviously really current. It's happening during this semester. The other, because when I first saw it, I thought it was from The Onion or Saturday Night Live. Did anybody else have that initial reaction to that particular piece of news? It can be really difficult to parody a parody. And in recent years, American life has gotten harder to parody, it seems to me. There wasn't real deep content in there other than the idea that clearly the current administration feels that TikTok influencers could in fact be a significant force in affecting the way the conflict in Ukraine is going. And that may be true. I'm not suggesting that it's not true. I'm suggesting that the world has become slightly surreal for that to be a possibility at this particular point. That last article you had, TikTok's black box obscures its role in Russia's war. Fascinating, fascinating article. Why is it so hard for researchers to figure out what's happening with the way information circulates in TikTok?
Okay, one of the reasons they said was that TikTok operates typically with videos and little text, so they cannot really identify keywords from the information that is being
That's
spread.
one of the factors. It would have to be transcribed in order to be able to be processed easily, and that takes time, energy, money. It takes resources to transcribe audio and video, which is a lot harder for researchers to come up with. That's one of the reasons. There were several reasons, actually. What other reasons were there?
They don't let researchers do it. They don't encourage it. They don't give them permissions to monitor in the way that some of the other social media does.
Yeah, there are a couple of things that many other social media companies provide that TikTok does not provide. One is a research API. What's an API? This is from another class, but those of you who had 610 should know what an API is.
Essentially a backdoor into where you can work with the code of the site itself and draw information without having to go page to page. It can just be automatically feed.
Yeah, you don't have to scrape it. It's an applications programming interface, basically a direct hookup to their data so that a researcher could have direct access to data. TikTok doesn't have a research API, unlike most of the other large social media companies. They also have no public ad library. And I wasn't aware of this until I read the article, but Meta, the new name for Facebook, but Meta owns Facebook and YouTube and Instagram. They maintain an ad library so that researchers can actually see all of the ads that actually show up on Meta products, which is that's a valuable source of information. You get some sense of who's advertising and what is it they're advertising. TikTok has no ad library that they make available to researchers. So that's another form of information that they don't share. There's one other big reason they mentioned besides those. What was it?
I think they said the way the way the TikTok algorithm is set up.
Yeah, what did they say about it?
That unlike other algorithms that essentially determine what to push through to you based on, I guess you could use the term your filter bubble. With TikTok, the reverse happens. It pushes through things that you have not yet, or content that you have not yet shown interest in. Something to that. That's how I understood. Maybe I misunderstood what I said.
It's clear that TikTok relies a lot more on their recommendation algorithm. Yes. And for all of the social media services, the recommendation algorithm is a trade secret. It's a heavily protected black box, kind of the core of the business. So nobody actually knows what's in the TikTok recommendation algorithm except the folks who work for the company. But it's clear that it provides very different results to somewhat similar inquiries. You change one little thing and big change in what you get in the way of suggestions. And it seems to do so in a way that's very difficult for researchers to get a handle on. They're having a lot of trouble sort of deconstructing the way the recommendation algorithm works. Since they don't have access to the API, and they can't quite figure out how the recommendation algorithm is working, it makes it really hard for them to study the way information is being distributed by TikTok. There are too many variables. They can't control enough at one time to get a handle on that. And I don't know if you noticed or not, but some of the content in the article indicated that TikTok, at least in the Ukraine conflict, was treated much more kindly by Russia than the other social media. And that there was some suspicion that TikTok may be cooperating a lot more with Russia and Russia's wishes than the other social media companies are, which may be one of the reasons they're not real excited about sharing a lot of this information right now. They may not.
There's a dual comment though, because they were also saying that was in part, the theory was because they're owned by China. So it was it was a bridge.
Yep. And it gets deeper and deeper and curiouser and curiouser. Absolutely true. So I actually don't have any more new content for you here. I think this is quite enough in terms of social media and politics, on which one could spend endless amounts of time. I think it's fun dealing with something that is this current. I mean, given you can look in today's news for stuff relevant to what we're talking about tonight. Do you have questions, comments, issues, things you'd like to address?
On the last bit with TikTok, and specifically, its usage in different governments. There was I forget the video, but there was a video that kind of gathered a bunch of TikTok videos put out by some Russian influencers, and it was kind of a peek into the propaganda of what Putin's doing right now. They were all essentially saying the same script. There was at least a couple dozen of these people saying the same exact thing, and of course there's a compelling image of playing them side by side and the audio pretty much lining up with one another. But it's important to remember that, like, yeah, so that's one tactic that can be used, putting out the same message. You're just getting now faces behind it. But a similar thing was put out in the US a couple of years ago through news broadcasters that were all owned by the same company. And they were saying the same script essentially. And I think they were in opposition to a vote that was, going through.
Well, it's now a recognized tactic. I mean, it doesn't belong to the right or the left. It is a tool among many tools for use of that particular medium, for better or worse. It's it's like the hands up the baseball bat. It's a cat and mouse game, to mix metaphors there. Cats and mice don't go with baseball bats, but you know what I mean. Questions, answers, issues, stuff to put on the table.
I shared a video on Twitter, and you have to like sort of take it with a grain of salt, because it is, depending on your politics, not somebody you necessarily watch. But John Oliver had a really cool piece about tracking and cookies and how they do it and how it all fits together. That was really helpful for my bigger understanding how terrifying it is. But anyway, it's on Twitter. I tweeted it. I know I'm the only person following Twitter at this point.
I'm following
it's there.
I'm not sure anybody but you and me are following the IDT 620 WVU hashtag on Twitter at this particular point. But thank you for tweeting that. I appreciate that, Noel. Other things? No, hearing none. Well, guys, we have one more meeting. We are, as you know, we are in week 14 of 15. So we will have our last meeting next Tuesday in week 15. We will cover the stuff from this week, week 14. There's very little reading for week 15. I think I've given you one article, maybe two, that's about it. But we will talk a little bit about the week 15 readings next week, even though it's just Tuesday when we meet, because it's our last meeting. And I'll also ask you a couple of questions that are sort of tying up the semester questions, since that's our last meeting. As you know, we have no final exam in this class. So once we get to the end of next week, we're done with the semester. That does mean that the drop dead date for turning anything in that you may not have completed is a week from this coming Friday, which is the last day of classes for this particular semester. So just a heads up there. Make sure that you're on track with stuff and getting it turned in. Most of you are, which is very good. I appreciate that. That's all I have for tonight. I'll stick around for a few minutes in case anybody has questions or anything else to deal with. But thank you for your time. And we'll get together one more time next Tuesday night. Bye for now.